Hi, I'm Jane Chow Pomeroy, and I wanted to talk about face masks. And while it's a protective measure for some, it amplifies issues for others, particularly our Black and Brown brothers and sisters. To give you some backstory, ever since we've been sheltering in place, probably like many of you, I've been experiencing this underlying constant feeling of urgency. On some days, it's anxiety, right? Around the question of what can I do? What can I do to help? And even in a larger sense, what can we as the church do? How can we bless our world with Christ during this pandemic season? That's when I saw on Facebook stories about hospitals and facilities experiencing face mask shortages, combined with photos of people making masks to meet that need. This instantly caught my attention because as a Taiwanese American, it was like seeing my two worlds merge. Growing up, face masks, they were normal, they were everywhere. In Taiwan, you see them at 7-Eleven, at drugstores, at departments. And on one hand, it was definitely used as a preventative measure against smog and pollution, but it was also seen as the courteous thing to do when you were maybe not feeling well. Knowing it was acknowledging that while we live in community, we want to do our part to try to minimize spreading any germs that we may or may not have. And so, yeah, so it was the kind of polite thing to do, but, you know, in the States, it wasn't the cultural norm. So it definitely took on a different tone. And so I never really wore masks in the States. But so I started to do research to see what it could look like to mobilize our churches to create face masks for those needing them. And that's when I started to come across the conversation on how this protective measure can potentially put others in danger. Honestly, I was a little surprised. I actually initially thought that face masks was something that was non-controversial. It was a way for us to use up our t-shirts that we weren't using and bond over how uncomfortable it is to wear them. I hadn't thought about how it can exacerbate racial profiling, which could lead to unsafe situations. So that's when I reached out to Dominique Gilliard, Director of Racial Righteousness and Reconciliation for Love, Mercy, Do Justice, to go deeper into this conversation and why should we, the church, care and how we can respond. All right, hey Dom, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So to kick us off, I wanted to ask you, what are your observations on the stigma surrounding face masks?
Well, we have to understand that given the fact that we've seen kind of racialization and stereotypes and associations be something that's been a part of our national fabric for so long, those things are really only amplified through the use of face masks because you're concealing a certain part of your face, which historically has made you look a little bit more prone to deviant activity. And so we've seen kind of in the midst of COVID, with the rise in xenophobia and anti-Asian American sentiments, but we've also seen in Latino and African American communities increased rate of profiling that's been taking place. Like perfect example is here in Chicago. One of our elected officials, an African American, Cam Buckner, got stopped in a store when he was wearing his face mask, and then he ultimately had to pull out his credentials, and then they were very apologetic. But because he was not in his traditional suit and tie when he went to the store and he had a face mask on, he was seen as more suspicious. And so he got stopped in a way that really felt invalidating, and in a way that had he not been wearing his face mask and was probably dressed up in a suit and tie, probably wouldn't have happened. And so it just leads to a more likelihood that you'll have these kind of encounters with law enforcement, which we've just seen kind of with our brother George Floyd, how that can go sideways and really have a detrimental outcome. And so I think the stigma is just really around how face masks really lead to an increased likelihood to actually have to have an encounter with law enforcement, which historically has been something that can actually have very fatal outcomes.
And so for the stigma around face masks, like, would you say that it's another separate issue, or is it a symptom of something that's larger that we're experiencing today?
Yeah, it's definitely a symptom. I mean, I think everything we're seeing with COVID, really, COVID's not creating new racial realities. It's just magnifying existing issues, systemic issues from access to quality healthcare to economic disparities to infrastructure disparities. I was doing an interview with a Native American pastor in the Covenant, and she was telling me how on reservations how hard it is to get access to any kind of quality health care, and the fact that they just got their first ventilators just last week. And when they just got them, they don't even have the infrastructure though to utilize them. So they actually ended up passing them along. And so like, that's not something that COVID created. That's a systemic, historic disparity that has been at play and continues and really is just being highlighted through this pandemic.
And finally, what are some ways that we as a church can stand in solidarity with those that are experiencing this?
Yeah, I think one of the most profound ways that the ECC can demonstrate solidarity right now is in communal contexts where people of color are absent or very few, um, affirming the testimonies and the narratives that covenant leaders in various parts of the country are articulating in the midst of their laments over these racial disparities and these acts of violence and hatred that we've been seeing really multiply in the last 2 months in a way that it just feels all encompassing, like from every side. I think while it's hard sometimes to believe things that we've never seen with our own eyes and we haven't experienced ourselves, I think part of what we commit to, particularly through the sixfold test, is purposeful narrative as being a vital piece of who we are as a covenant family. And part of that purposeful narrative is slowing ourselves, being quick to listen and slow to speak, and to really hear from the pain of our sisters and brothers and to affirm that pain, not just individually, but within our communal spaces, going back into our families, into our churches. And when we hear people marginalizing kind of a racial atrocity or something like the racial stigmas that accompany face masks, saying like, hey, I think we actually should listen to our brothers and sisters of color who actually have a different testimony, who have actually experienced this firsthand or have witnessed it within their own community. And so I think kind of the affirmation of the purposeful narrative that is shared throughout the body is one of the most profound ways that we can stand in solidarity right now. But I think even in addition to that, there are things from, I mean, there's a lot of pressure right now to reopen states and reopen churches. I think the church has to think theologically around this question. While I know everybody misses community, we all want to be back together. And I know that there's even economic realities that are pushing certain decisions in certain contexts. But I think in the midst of us really discerning what does it mean to really put the needs and interest of others before our own in a Christ-like way, Philippians 2, as we really try to seek the peace and the prosperity and the flourishing of our cities, as we really try to love our neighbors well, particularly our vulnerable neighbors, the most vulnerable, the immunocompromised, the elderly, various populations that we know that if we came back together right now, that they wouldn't be able to join us. I think we really have to think through, like, what does it mean for us to love our neighbors well? And I think part of practicing solidarity is making sacrificial choices for the collective. And I think as we do that, another final way to kind of practice solidarity right now is to really look at how some of the economic disparities and the need that exists in our nation and our world has led to a reality where certain people don't even have access to face masks. And so through this whole entire project, I think one of the ways that the church practices solidarity is through making face masks for other people and distributing them where there is need. So I think there's a whole host of ways in which we can really try to practice solidarity right where we are, while respecting kind of social distancing, but intentionally trying to bear witness to the love of Christ, because scripture tells us that the world will come to know that we are Christ's disciples through how we love one another. And so this project really gives the church a tangible way to love one another while being responsible.
Right. Thanks, Dom. That was really great. Really good to hear things from your perspective, and I definitely really appreciated your encouragement for us to be listening to others, to listen to their stories. I think a lot of times when I think about standing in solidarity, I'm always thinking about like, what can I do? How can I save? But really, it's to be willing to kind of take that step back and to listen to other people's stories and then to believe them.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I definitely, yeah, I really appreciate this. I appreciate your work.